All right, so very important day as we finish up this. We're going to be basically coming up with the final math to be able to determine whether these cards are overpowered, underpowered, or right on a curve. We're going to apply this to the card game Harmony, and we're going to start actually making a spreadsheet for that so that we can determine and see for ourselves which cards and decks were overpowered and underpowered. It's pretty obvious just from playing it what it is, but it's nice to have that mathematical
representation.
Yeah, to show us that it's what we feel is actually realistic, but then we can also play around with associated formulas to be able to say, if I make these changes, how does it affect the balance of everything in the game? Now you can start to use some kind of formulaic search to come up with, all right, what can I do to get as many cards on this curve as I can, or very close to this curve, where maybe they're a little bit better than the curve or a little bit worse than the curve, but it's not going to feel like that in practice usually. So we had our very simple trading card game reminder of how it works. You have a deck of 10 cards. You're going to draw a hand of 3 cards. You and your opponent are going to select a card to play and place them face down in front of you. Then you reveal them at the same time. There were 3 elements to a card. There was the cost, which was an HP cost to you. You start with 10 life. And when you play a card that costs 1, you immediately, when you reveal it, take 1 damage. If it costs 2, you immediately take 2 damage. Then there's a comparison between the cards that are in play. Any card that has if your card has a higher strength than your opponent's card gets discarded. If your opponent's card has a higher strength than your card gets discarded. And if they are the same strength, they both stick around. Any card that has stuck around deals damage proportional or exactly equal to the damage on the card to your opponent's life. So cost is paid no matter what. Strength determines which sticks around. Damage hits your opponent. So the goal is to keep your card around so that it deals damage to your opponent. We came up with this formula for strength, which was very nice. As we were able to do this, we would be able to see that we can see that the card value of the associated strength, yikes. We came up with, now we can come up with the entire card value. So this isn't zeroed in yet to determine what is on curve or off curve, but it gives you an associated power for each one of these cards. And when I first revealed these, a few people in class were identifying and saying something like, wow, the hero looks like it's way stronger than everything else. And this is mathematical verification that sure enough, to the best of our ability with some assumptions that we made about the metagame, that it looks like it is incredibly good compared to the rest of the cards. But the other cards are pretty on par with each other. So the first thing to note is, well, all cards are above the curve. Well, we haven't included the average damage if our opponent's card gets through. So we can scale this based on taking this cost and adding to the cost, not just the cost of the card, but the chance that our opponent's card is not removed and does damage back to us. So if we incorporate that, we get this table. And now 0 is right on the curve. And we can see that some cards are weaker than the curve, and 1 card is annoyingly significantly stronger than the curve. So first 3 cards are weak and hero is drastically OP. So now the question I have is, doing all of this or knowing all of this, what changes can we make to this to try to balance this? So this is going to become the exercise for the first, let's say 10 minutes, the next 10 minutes or so, is see if you can use this overall card value and start to make some changes to the numerical values of these cards to try to get as close to 0, 0, 0, 0 as you possibly can. As you do this, try to give each one of these cards some kind of distinct reason you would play them. So make them as distinct from each other as you can while doing this. You can easily make this 0, 0, 0, and 0 by making them all the same thing. Called the same thing, but have exactly the same cost, strength, and damage. That is boring. That is incredibly boring. So 2 goals, make them as distinct as possible from each other. And these totals should align as closely as possible to all 0. Once you apply this total formula to the changes to the numbers that you would make. Does that make sense? Any clarification needed? Raise your hand if you have any questions. Totally okay. If you're the only one, I'd be happier to do that than not. Make sense? All right, let's mess around with these values and see how it affects these totals. I do, don't I? Open, close, close.
That's 5 points off.
Right? Yeah. The strength minus 1/5 should be one component. In fact, I'll just go fix that right now. It's confusing. It's bothering me now that it's been pointed out. The nice thing about PowerPoint, you don't have to compile it. It's fair. If this were in LaTeX, that would have taken a little bit.
Right.
Actually pretty fast.
Hang on a second.
You have to reopen the file that's not the PDF, then you have to make the change, then you have to recompile, then you have to reopen the PDF, then you have to scroll to the appropriate page.
You're just getting the live of what the LaTeX PDF output is, so every time I can just change it and you can immediately see.
Yeah, I use Kyle and it allows you, and it both shows like a live preview of the PDF. And it lets you like just select the line in the source text file and then jump to that in the PDF.
Yeah, that is really nice.
What? Yeah.
For anyone who just walked in or joined, we are taking this new formula that represents everything that we can take into account right now, assuming this metagame. And we are trying to make changes to the cost, strength, and damage of our cards to try to get to 2 outcomes. We want these cards to be as distinct from each other as possible, and these totals to be as close to 0 as possible once we calculate them with the changes that have been made.
They have to be integers.
Do they have to be integers? Let's say yes, because a cost has to be, we don't want to deal fractional damage. That seems like it's going to be a pain. Strength should be easily comparable. If anything, strength could probably be a partial number, but the solution that I will show will have all integers. So I'm curious if people can come up with something that is better than the solution I will present.
Are they found all to be zeros or just keep it as close as possible?
As close as possible. They do not all have to be zeros. So it's okay for things to be above or below the curve by a little bit, but we don't want something that is anywhere near this drastic. I would say it's probably possible, and you should aim to have the worst, the most unbalanced card have an absolute value of about 0.4. Yeah. Nice. I would say that's a good solution.
It's just Excel is pretty good.
Yeah, right?
It's really handy.
I'm doing it with my calculator.
I mean,
And that's why the person who's using Excel is done.
Well, you can deliberate out this.
But did he learn any?
Yeah.
It's so person, it's like the thing prescribed, not described, or whatever.
Yeah, yeah,
Here's your data, I don't know what it means, but
but it
it's
works.
very powerful, yeah.
Mhm.
So we want to keep heroes positive here.
Feel free to work together with people on this too. This does not have to be an individual exercise.
But we want to keep this positive.
Yeah, yeah, so making it really painful to play. So if you're close to death yourself, you can't play a card that's gonna have high strength and do high damage.
Trying to keep the strengths all the same and adjusting the damage to make it a little more bearable.
Okay,
They're not getting exactly zero, I'm getting like point.
yeah, we have 3 dials we can pick for each card. So maybe keeping an anchor and saying, well, these strengths are correct. How can we modify the other 2 to keep these in line? Or maybe the damages are correct. How can we change the cost and the strength
Because
to
if
deal
you
with that?
keep up the cost of one per hero, lower the strength by 1, you get to negative 0.2.
Yeah.
While looking at this, what we're going for, which is supposed to be a powerful card, right?
Yeah, well, hero seems like it's a high damage card, but it's a high damage card that's too consistent.
Yeah, you have. Lower a couple numbers. Cost of 6, but the damage is 0.
It's a card I stuck into my opponent's deck.
Yeah, close.
Yeah, oh yes. Oh, yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. I was gonna go with the card tray or the card throwing cards. I swear, a Black Lotus flies further than any other Magic card. Just try it out.
Why would you do that?
No, I'm a big fan of chaos confetti. I'm a big fan of chaos confetti.
Mhm.
Have you heard of that one?
Yes,
You literally have to tear the card into shreds and then throw it.
there is actually an uncard in Magic that actually, it's extremely powerful, but when you play it, you do actually have to rip it up.
Like a
It's part of its
chaos
cost.
kind of thing.
Wow.
There's a legend that someone did that with the chaos board in the tournament.
What's that cost?
Or that destroyed everything on play.
Yeah.
Creating these cards was funny.
My friend had a chaos confetti. He used lands instead of pairing up the actual card to throw because he had like millions of land. But yeah, it was interesting. He landed mostly when he threw it, most of it landed on his own stuff, so it was kind of funny.
How are we doing? Have people come up with some reasonable solution to this? Who's still working? Let's see a show of hands of people who would like a little bit longer to make this work out. Couple people? Let's give you a couple more minutes to see what we can come up with. I'm curious what differences we come up with, but there's not only one answer to this.
This, like the closest I could get to 0.
These ones are good. Only 2. It's just 0.4.
Only 2.
Strength's the same for sure.
It does, yeah.
Are they distinct from each other is the next question I would have. Do these cards feel very different? Especially if they're named something like cleric. Does it feel like a cleric or closer to a cleric? Does a hero still feel like a hero?
I would, 033.
I made the hero and the cleric do the same amount of damage, but they cost different, and they have different strengths. So the cleric's less likely to hit, but it costs less than the hero.
So basically it's, maybe it's psychic manipulation of some kind,
Yeah.
doing mental damage instead of physical damage. We'll go with that.
Or there's less people the cleric would want to hurt, so that's why you'd like just choose not to hurt someone.
Maybe.
Except for another cleric, because you know, clerics don't get along with each other.
All right, I'm kind of curious. Does anyone want to come right up their table of cost, strength, damage total as this? I will allow 4 people to do this at a time. So, I don't know. You could have 3 people.
You got the totals up.
Does anyone else?
Oh, yeah, that's a number.
That was my point. I think it's good.
Post reference.
Oh, with the little amount of fun.
That's true. Let's give this.
Close enough.
And I'm like,
Sorry. Thanks.
I mean,
We
maybe
need more.
one card.
For those who are remote, I'll pan the screen so you can see all of these too. One that's done is this one over here. So here is one possible solution right behind me. Although I don't know what it was people misspelling thief. It looks like 2 of the 3 people made thief instead of thief.
Oh yeah, it's supposed to be iPad before you spelled it out.
So there's one, and here are the other 2.
Even I spelled it right. I don't spell it right.
I get it, I before you accept that receipt. They're in the English language.
We have five confidence in
C class, C.I.P.
The
This goes elected, except me.
issue is my entire family, we're all English teachers and professors going back generations. I'm the first computer scientist, but I had grammar ground into me from a young age.
Actually, my stepmom as well.
Yep. So these are not the same,
Very close.
but they're pretty close. That's interesting to see and think. So what patterns do we see?
The thief is usually the same across the board.
Yeah, the thief did 1, 4, 3, 1, 4, 3, 1, 4, 3. Yeah, it was an easy fix to take that minus 0.6 and turn it into a 0.2 by just adding 1 damage. Does it still feel like a thief? Has pretty high strength and pretty moderate damage, so it's fine. How about the cleric? What changes did we see across the cleric? 033 was perfectly on curve. And 134 is not too far off. So that's really good.
135 is technically even better.
Yeah, 135 is a little bit better, but still close enough to really be considered balanced. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of these. And it kind of still feels like a cleric. It still keeps its original design at least. It's just a small tweak to bring it in line. And the fighter, we have some very different fighters. We have 161 that was really close to on curve, and two people, no, we have 161, 152, and 253. Interesting. And they're all within an absolute value of 0.4 of on curve. Cool. And the hero was mostly fixed by either drastically upping its cost or somewhat upping its cost and somewhat lowering its strength. So at least now it can be defeated. So I could see both of these having a really interesting reaction or a really interesting change in the strategic value of it in a deck. On one hand, it always still does its damage as a high damage, but now it has a very high cost associated with it. You're gonna hit yourself for 4 to hit your opponent for 5. And both of those are guaranteed to happen. Does that create any interesting strategic decision with the hero? Now it is deterministic. It's prescribed what the hero is going to do when you play it. It takes away a little bit of the mystery of what is my opponent going to play? Is my hero going to get through or be successful? Whereas something like the 3-4-5, now the hero can be defeated and you hit yourself for 3 and get no value. So if you can count cards or you know what's in your opponent's deck and they've played their high strength cards or more high strength cards, then you can get a sense of, I've been holding on to this hero for the right time to play it to get through for the right amount of damage. Now I can hit myself for 3 to deal 5. So to me, that's a little bit more strategic of an outcome. But again, numerically, they are balanced. But this is a great example of just because they're balanced doesn't mean that you're done balancing the game because the game is not played on a particular cost curve. There needs to be some strategic value to each one of these cards. But again, none of this is wrong. I think this is all really good, and it allows us to have these kinds of conversations about what is the point of each of these cards within this game. That. Questions on any of this? All right. Here is one such balance pass. And we came up with some very similar things to this, which is great to see. So since we have a basic cost curve, what's nice is we can design more cards. So we could also create new mechanics. As we do all of this, we just make sure that the balance of everything that we add ties back to the cards based on this formula that we've indented, or a formula that we would then continue to add to if we added some new mechanics. So if you want to do anything you can do to this, we have some tie back to some concept of balance. The difficult part of this was just coming up with the formula. Now we're just applying the formula to the existing cards, to new cards. So if you're curious, you can actually go to this site and there are some more cards to this game and you can start to see what that would look like. But one other thing that we could do is think up some new mechanics to this game or think up another card and try to balance it. Yeah, so you could have some kind of healing mechanic. What would that look like as a card? So now instead of damage, it would do a negative amount of damage. And if it does negative damage, maybe it heals you rather than damaging your opponent.
By the back of the cost, technically what it would be.
Yeah, because now healing is a benefit. So a negative cost would be the equivalent benefit.
So you could have something like, was it heal? It heals 3, costs 1, so negative That is -200. Of course, we plug that into C.
Right. But it would be really interesting if you try to heal, if you're not guaranteed to be able to heal because
you
of,
need to have a high enough.
yeah, you
strength
have to have a
get
high
through.
enough strength to be able to get that card through. So that would also create a very interesting dynamic for trying to play a healing card. Or a healing card could become what has very, very high strength. And now you're certainly healing yourself for sure. And an additional benefit to that heal could be that it possibly cancels out some damage that the opponent does,
And makes them waste the high.
essentially. Yeah, so you can see how this really starts to flow in and makes it really easy to create new mechanics and balance those new mechanics, because you're not worrying about what are all of the different ways that this new mechanic is related to all of the existing mechanics. We've already made a formula that ties all of those existing mechanics together in a way that showcases the value of that in a card. Questions or discussion items on this? I could make an in-class activity out of this, but I want to get us to dealing with harmony as fast as possible, I think, so that there's time left to work on that and then get started on what's going to be your final paper that will deal with that. So let's think about, all right, cost curves for already released games. Why would we care to go through that work? The game is already released, it's already out there. You developed it. Why would you care to make a cost curve for your game that you've already released?
If you're gonna make DLC or wanna do balance patches or anything, you're
Yep.
gonna need to.
If you're going to expand on the game and you want to make new content for that game, you want to make sure that that new content is relevant. How about balance for sequels or future games that use those kinds of systems? If you've invented some kind of really fun system and now you have intellectually protected that idea, and now you're the only person who can use that system. Think the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor. Yeah,
Copyrighted that.
they have copyrighted that. And it is now unable to be copied until what, 2036, I think?
They have done nothing with it since.
Right, that, well, the company is disbanded. So they can't do anything with it, they don't exist. Which is really frustrating that now no one can do that because of the protection of the intellectual property. Aside from that, if you have some genius idea like that, then you can be the one to really explore the space around that idea and come up with what are the new mechanics that work well with that and be able to balance that. Of course, your own players may attempt to reverse engineer this. So this is a fun way, if you're playing a game, to try to come up with a mathematical model of a game. If you do this, then you can start to come up with your own functions and come up with your own way of determining the balance of game objects. If you keep that to yourself and or publish it, then you can start to get a competitive advantage in a game. If players do this and developers have not done this, developers can use the work their players have done to develop their own internal cost curve for developing future content in that game. So the question I have for people now, and this is something that we could start to explore possibly next quarter. I have quite a few things that I want to do, but is there interest in a deep dive to developing a cost curve for Magic the Gathering? There's some work that I could show based on developing cost curves for Magic the Gathering. That's probably very interesting to people who play Magic the Gathering and very not interesting to people who do not play Magic the Gathering. But my thought is just, it's something that we could cover next quarter after we deal with everything else that I think is more important than just the optional stuff. So keep this in the back of your mind as something that we could do if there's interest in time. Cost curves for free-to-play games. This is fun and not fun at the same time. Free-to-play games are just the bane of my own personal existence. So bear with me as I groan and grumble about the fact that they even exist. Their entire systems are frustrating to me for the most part, but initial cost curve for a free-to-play game, the whole purpose of it is to we're gonna talk about the funnel, basically. We want everyone to want to download and play the first few levels of a free-to-play game. Why? Because it's someone who might spend money on the game. So you don't want to turn them away immediately. You want to hook them with something that does not require them to spend money, so that now they want to spend money to continue having the levels of progression that they've become used to. So graph of this cost curve would show everything on the curve. But as the demand rises for things, player has enough of that thing to meet the game's goals initially. Everything's on that curve, but the game is giving you everything that you need to keep up with that curve. So goal retention, basically. You want all of your players to keep playing the game through the tutorial, through the first few levels, just enough to be either addicted to the game or want to see what happens next. After this point, we are going to start increasing the difficulty past the resources that we are giving the players. So think of it as the first hit is free. It really maps really well to addiction and drugs, because it's basically using that same psychological construct. So because you'll also give free premium currency to offset that difficulty the first time. So you're giving people, hey, look, here's 500 diamonds. And that's enough for your first couple of big purchases. And it feels like, wow, the game is so generous. It's giving me all of the stuff that I've had an option to go in the store and see that 500 diamonds cost $10. Whoa, the game just gave me 10 free dollars. But then it drops off. The difficulty curve starts to increase, and the associated cost curve for your own power to keep up with that is anticipating that you're continuing to spend these diamonds. They're no longer giving you this premium currency. So the difficulty ramps up again, it doesn't give you the premium currency, and now unless you are spending money, you're starting to feel weak. So the entire curve is created for those who are spending money, and the developers don't care too much if you are not spending money if you stop playing. If you don't spend money, you either have to spend arduously more time, or give the money, or quit the game. Those are kind of your three options as a player. And from a designer's perspective, sure, you can allow them to grind out the game, because that will continue to apply that monetary pressure. As you get closer and closer to the goal, maybe you've been working on that goal for 2 weeks, and you still see that you're a week away from your goal. But if you just pony up $5 now instead of $10, you can get there today. So that's still an ideal point to retain those players. It feels very bad. One other thing, limited benefit is never negative. What that means is something like a sword that deals extra damage against dragons. I've used that a few times now, but even if you don't put any dragons in your game, it's a limited benefit that might as well be nothing. It's never a drawback.
Just make the sword look really cool.
Yeah,
People want to use it.
exactly. So you can also, if you're trying to figure out the cost curve of a player choice, you can assume that it has the value of the better of those two options. And of course, which of those options is better might be conditional on some internal game state. Sometimes option 1 will be better, sometimes option 2 will be better, but whenever that choice is presented to the player, assume that they are going to pick the better option. And that is what you want to balance around. If someone chooses the worse option, they need to get good. If you add a useless extra option, it does not change the value of the choice, because you're again assuming that the player is going to choose the best option for themselves. And most players are capable of making that decision relatively intelligently. If you're designing options, then you want there to be a reason that the player would choose any of those options. You also want to make those options as distinct as possible, so that the decision is interesting. If you have a game with a bunch of different abilities, then figure out the values of those abilities separately. And if they're initial, then it can be a little bit difficult to figure out how did the skill lead to that value? What about that skill created that value? So it's worth thinking about them all separately, even though some skills may work together better or not work well together. So for instance, let's say you have a less damaging ability that freezes an enemy and a more damaging ability that anticipates the enemy is going to stand still for a long period of time before it does a massive amount of damage. If you're just looking at them separately, then you can value them as what they are. You look at them together and you say, well, I choose to use skill number 1 to freeze the enemy, and then I know it's going to be in position for the big wind up and hit. So if you side on the underpowered side as well, then you can always buff things. On the other hand, if you set things to be overpowered, players really don't like it when you scale back the value of something that they have become accustomed to or used to. So if you're making a new object, don't put it right on the cost curve. Put it below the cost curve and then bring it up to the balance. That said, that creates another issue with your player base. If you're releasing new content and your players learn, don't ever do anything that is new. It's never the best thing to do because they're always putting it below the cost curve. Then any hype about new content for your game might be met with apathy from your player base. So there's a balance to play there. You want it to be balanced, but if you don't know, err on the side of underpowered. Or you can also err on the side of overpowered and just anticipate you're gonna have to bring everything else up to be in line with the new ability. Yeah.
I mean, if there's something that you release that's overpowered and it needs to end up being nerfed, if it only happens, if it's not like a common occurrence, probably.
Yeah, it's going to happen at some point. You're going to make a mistake, think that it's on curve and realize that there's an error in your formula. And actually what you've just released is drastically overpowered. Oops, it happens to the best developers.
If you do that though, you risk making your players mad because then it can sort of feel like, oh, I released this new DLC that has all these really cool weapons, and so people buy it, so they use the really powerful weapons, and it sort of feels like you're baiting and switching the players almost.
Especially in single player games.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yep.
so you have to be very careful with that.
Yep, that is also very true. Just keep in mind everything about your player base, how they are going to be perceiving the content that you make. You want them to be excited about it, but you also don't want it to become the gold standard of everyone wants to use the new stuff because it's the only thing now that is optimal. So if you're going to do something like that and you're going to shoot for overpowered, then make some balance changes to everything else to bring it up to that level. Live service games, of course, you have to balance it against the best content that exists in the game so that your new content is going to be used. You don't want to balance it against the average content in the game. You want to balance it with the best content in the game. This leads to what we're going to call cost curve inflation, where every time you release new content, it's the new best thing in the game, or it's equivalent to the best thing in the game. So people start using it. Eventually, the older stuff starts to feel bad, and people wonder, why is this even in the game anymore? So you need to up the power level of everything over and over and over, and you just get more and more power inflation. So we call this power creep as well. If you've heard of power creep in games, that's basically what is happening from a designer's side of the two-way window, where the designers are looking at you and you are not looking at the designers. So of course, if your players want to interact with that new content, then they will continue to want to play the game, come back to it. So it can help with the retention of the game as well. Any questions before we move on to Harmony? My initial plan is to kind of introduce this and let people get started today, and we're going to spend the next couple of class periods in class actively working on this. So my plan is to not record those extra days. So anyone who is remote, as soon as we introduce this, you're either gonna want to attend or just keep working on this because we're going to be working on this in class over the next couple of days. So tomorrow and Monday is my plan. So let's start applying a cost curve to Harmony. The goal of this is to figure out the value of heal, damage, draw, and discard. So we want to make a cost curve for each of these mechanics to figure out how good are each of these mechanics. What is the value of heal 1? The value of heal 2? What is the value of heal 3? What is the value of damage 1, damage 2, damage 3, draw 1, draw 2, draw 3? Then we can ask things like, are the relationships linear? Are they something else? What kind of curve represents how good each of these mechanics are? How much better is throwing draw 3 on a card than draw 1? How about generic power versus a specific power? So it's time to make a spreadsheet. How are we going to do this? We're going to have columns for each specific power type and general power. We'll have columns for each mechanic: heal, damage, draw, and discard. We'll have a column for adding the benefits and subtracting the costs. Unfortunately, I am not giving you this formula, nor is there one appropriate formula for this. You will have to come up with the formula that adds the benefits and subtracts the costs. So the formula that we came up with that dealt with damage and strength and cost from the basic trading card game, how we came up with that formula, you are going to have to come up with that formula for Harmony. So the goal of all of this is that when you evaluate each card, so each row is going to be a card that has one of these particular sets of, you just go across all of these and fill in the associated columns, and that will represent some card. Then there's a column that's going to represent its power. Benefits minus costs, you want this to be 0, based on whatever formula it is that you make. You are going to declare that 0 is balanced, anything that is negative is underpowered, anything that is positive is overpowered. So a row for each card with its benefits and original costs. You're going to put in every card as it currently exists. Then you can think about, all right, based on this, which cards are most overpowered and most underpowered? Once you have that basic idea, then you can start to adjust the associated cards. You can adjust the costs of the cards. You can adjust whether it does, how much, so does it take generic? Does it take any of the exact types? Does it take more or less of that? Does it, instead of draw 2, does it now just draw 1? Does it draw 3? Does it draw 1, damage 1? Does it, what do we do? So don't change the type of power of the card, only the quantity, because we have themed decks. We have kind of we had a bio gear deck. We had actually, I don't know if that was an actual combination or not.
I think
We
that's
had,
one of the few that wasn't.
yeah, yeah. So a bioscience deck, forget if that was one, but whatever the.
Bioscience, biomagic.
Yeah, yeah. So for the bioscience deck, every card that costs bio, keep it costing bio. Every card that costs science, keep it costing science. But you can change it costing 2 science to costing 3 science or 1 science. So with the last few minutes, for those of you who have a computer with them, go ahead and you can start setting this up and asking questions. For everyone else, just kind of start thinking and planning. Maybe you can even start coming up with a formula, start listing out those benefits and detriments, start trying to come up with the value of each one of those cards. Remember that the cards are listed on Canvas. So even if you don't have the cards with you, you can open up Canvas and take a look at the decks and start thinking about how are we going to evaluate these cards. I'll also throw up this slide deck so that people can refer to any of this information as you start to work on this. But I'll come back to this slide momentarily. You're going to continue this process at home. Once you've done everything here, where you can start to adjust these costs, the final project for you is to make this game your own. So you can add some mechanics. Completely change up how this game works. Change up the formulas for things as you add or remove mechanics. So what new cards can you make? Maybe you want to replace some cards and say, this particular card in this deck just never seems to do anything. I don't like it, even though it's on curve. I don't like playing it. It's not a fun card to play. Can you design something that is fun to play in its place and is balanced and on curve? That'll involve lots of play testing. So feel free to, if you don't have some friends in here, make some friends in here and play some Harmony. We will come up with a date probably at the end of next week. Maybe the start of the final week of class, where I'd like to dedicate a couple of in-class play testing days, where you're gonna bring in a draft of what you've done. And after you've really finalized this and come up with it, I will be, I think, tomorrow giving you additional blank trading cards, so that once you finalize something that you're really happy with, you can make a physical version of the game that you have made based on Harmony, and we'll come in and play that with each other to start getting some additional ideas about what are the strengths and weaknesses of what you did. What did other people do that worked or didn't work? We're gonna have those kinds of discussions, and then that's what you'll write your paper on, is the experience you had designing this game for yourself, play testing it in person, and what ideas, if you could continue this process, what are the next ideas for improvement that you have? Question?
So on the canvas, the thing that you upload with all the Harmony parts, the PNG, is there any chance you could just upload like a text version or something like that, just so I can copy in the names instead of having to manually type them in?
I can try to do that. I'd have to use some kind of PDF to text converter, but that's
You don't have the
possibly.
original?
It was an image from a book. And that image is an image. It's not even text. Yeah,
I was gonna ask if you do that, maybe add like the damage or whatever else, the damage costs, maybe like a JSON or something.
yeah, that would be even better.
Yeah,
If one person has the time and ability to do that, I'm actually pretty crunched at the moment, then we could share that with people. So if one person, I will do this if in a couple days someone hasn't done it already. As soon as I have time to. But yeah, if someone is motivated to do that and then share it with the class, that would be wonderful. So last bit of stuff here. So basically design some cards, add them to your spreadsheet, balance them, figure out what matches your existing curve, design some new mechanics, new rules, new keywords. Make sure that you change your associated function that you're using as you do this. If you make those changes, you may have to make an additional balance pass over the existing card. Something that used to be balanced may become horribly imbalanced. And of course, be creative. There's no one right answer to this. This is a massive design space, and be creative with it. So you will get new physical cards tomorrow. And whenever you are ready to transcribe your new game onto those cards, you can do that. Keep in mind, the goal is still the same here, that you want to have 4 50-card decks that are balanced to play against each other. So in about a week, we're going to play test these things in class. So that is starting on Sunday. Once you submit your very last assignment in here, this becomes your next assignment. Figure this out, then the very last week, you'll probably write up what your results were. Questions on the last couple of weeks of class and what we're going to be doing?
Are we
Alright.
allowed to work in groups on this?
As long as each of you, I want you each to come up with an individual idea. But if that involves talking to each other to brainstorm,
I mean, like,
That's
for, like
okay.
the formula part.
yeah, if you wanted to come up with something like that, because you're gonna be going off and doing your own thing at that point, the baseline for coming up with this can be a group activity.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not an
That's my big thing.
individual
is The
outcome.
formula, I feel
Yeah.
like it's gonna be the hardest part.
Yeah. Yeah.
For for the final, are we allowed to introduce non-card elements like tokens?
You could, yeah, you could have something like a token that you could add to a card that changes what it does. Maybe every time it goes to the discard pile, it gets a token. Maybe, I don't know. Sure.
What?
Every time this goes from the discard to your hand, it gains 1 damage. Huge design space. There's so much you can do with this. So much you can do. Really only limited by your creativity and what is going to be balanced.
Deck just gets an exodia.
Just print a lack bloatus or. I don't know. Have fun with it, but that's it for the day. We're gonna come back to tomorrow and we'll spend all of class tomorrow working on this. I'll see you for that tomorrow.